Simultaneous Interpreting and Functionalist Perspective. The paper discusses a number of theoretical and methodological issues which arise when professional simultaneous conference interpreting (DSI) is studied through the functionalist theory of translation and interpreting proposed by Vermeer. Translation and interpreting. The professional activities of translation and interpreting can be regarded as fraternal twins. In the 60s, Kate and Newbert tried to get a theoretical grip on the translational activity, be it oral or in writing. However, it tended to favor translation research over the study of interpreting. After all, the paradigms of modern linguistics were oriented to the analysis of written words and sentences, rather than oral performance, since the study of oral communication is difficult regarding research methodology. Obviously, the development of translation and interpreting theory over the past decades is very complex. Translation research and theory have a wide range of methods and models. However, the interpreting studies seems to be a narrower field, labeling interpreting studies as a field with little theoretical development. The end justifies the translation. Theoretical studies of translation in the 60s and 70s were inspired by linguistic theories of the day and were primarily concerned with the equivalence between source and target language texts. The 70s then saw a reorientation in the study of language communication. It got focused on the text and its function in a given communicative situation. Applying this functionalist view also to text in translation. Translation scholars like Race and Vermeer put as a top priority the purpose of the text, scopus, in the process of translation. The scopus theory holds that the target text must first and foremost make sense within its communicative situation and culture. If the scopus is the all-important variable, who determines it and how? Professional translation and interpreting is normally done on assignment. Some individual or institution needs a text in order to establish communication across barriers of language and culture, and commissions an expert to do the job. The scopus arises from the assignment, requirements of the client. The details of the case must be made explicit, either by the client or more typically by the expert, negotiating for specific information about that target text. In the case of translation, the assignment is essentially the text to be translated. It is at this point that one may begin to wonder whether and how this theoretical conception applies to oral translational activity, in particular in simultaneous conference interpreting. SI in a functionalist framework, scopus in simultaneous conference interpreting. Departing from Holt's comprehensive theoretical conception, it is easy to show that in conference interpreting, the relationship between the client and the interpreter is not as straightforward. The conference interpreter's client doesn't want a text to be translated, but needs a much more complex communicative event. The conference can be viewed as a global sort of text composed of many individual texts. This hypertext, as I would like to call it, is a holistic unit. Accepting, then, that the conference or hypertext is the basic level category in the analysis of SI, or simultaneous conference interpreting. It follows the scopus in SI is situated at the level of conference assignment. Unlike Vermeer, who uses the notion of scopus also to refer to the function of the target text, I would like I would like to suggest that it's not some particular target text scopus, but the hypertext scopus that governs the production of functional texts in SI. The function of the individual text in SI can be perceived as a systemic variable in the communicative interplay of speakers and listeners, physically co-present and given place and time. It will be the context which determines the functional characteristics of the text. The function of an original speech or its interpretation is therefore not limited to the analysis of the text, but can rely on the socio-psychological data and dynamics of the situation of interaction.
Intratextual coherence. It is a basic principle of the scopus theory that the target text public generally doesn't compare the translation with the source text but considers it as a text in its own right within the target culture. The crucial standard to be met by any product of translation and interpreting is the degree to which it is coherent, understandable, interpretable, and meaningful within its particular situational context in a given target cultural environment. In the scopus theory, intratextual coherence refers to a sort of global quality, to the coherent relationships between the purpose, meaning, form, and effect of the text. It is obvious that communicative patterns and expectations within a given culture will play a key role in determining whether a text is considered coherent. In terms of the theory of translational norms, a translated text would be judged if it fits the demands for explicitness, order, clarity, etc., made on comparable native texts in the target culture. Chesterman speaks of such product norms as expectancy norms. In the case of the production norms for simultaneous interpreting, one of the most important professional norms, in Chesterman's terminology, is the equivalence of effect, referred to a good interpretation by authorities in the field. The interpretation should sound like an original speech, so listeners forget that they are listening to an interpreter rather than the original speaker. In translational theory, a simultaneous interpretation would usually be expected to be communicative rather than semantic, and instrumental rather than documentary type. The target text in simultaneous interpreting will need to be as acceptable, appropriate, informative, and read by target cultural standards as the source text within the communicative traditions of the source culture. In the case cultures are too different, the target text in simultaneous interpreting will have to be adapted to the communicative patterns and text type conventions, expectancy norms, generally accepted for native texts in the culture in question. When studying translation and interpreting as a process of cultural transfer, only a small fraction of culture-specific phenomena will be the textualized portion of the social cultural background. In the context of translation theory, language and culture tend to be situated on some sort of national level. For example, French as the language of France and part of the French culture, Greek as the language of Greece and part of the Greek culture, and so on. Vermeer has suggested the term paraculture to refer to culture as at the level of a people, nation, or society. Also, a national society is structured not only on a regional historical basis, but also along the lines of social classes, professions, and interest groups. Vermeer labels this sort of subgroup within a paraculture as a diaculture. The term Idioculture is used to denote the behavioral and communicative conventions that one single person has developed for himself or herself. As any interpreter and translator will know from experience, such idiocultural phenomena on the part of the speaker or writer can pose a special challenge to the operation of cultural transfer. In the examples from the case study, the emphasis will be on the relationship between paraculture and diaculture in the situational context of simultaneous interpreting. The case study is the 36th World Congress of the International Council for Small Businesses, a 3-day scientific technical congress in the field of small business management. The conference languages were English and German, with simultaneous interpretation provided for all sessions scheduled in the plenary room. The 6 sessions comprising the corpus were the opening session, family business workshops 1 and 2, the standards workshop, the joint ventures paper session, and the closing plenary. There were 50 conference speakers and 3 interpreters, A, B, C. In the translation theory, forms of address are often cited as a typical example of culture-specific text-type conventions. Because of the more direct and personal type of interaction in a conference situation, this issue seems even more relevant for the theory of interpreting. In the opening session of the Congress, the president of the international organization and its regional European affiliate, 2 university professors by the names of Kirchhoff from USA and Mugler from Austria, address one another on the podium. When Mugler addresses his international counterpart in English as Bruce, the interpreter A, who interprets from English to German, turns this into President Kirchhoff. Similarly, the executive secretary of a former Austrian ambassador is addressed as Botschafter Hinterger, Ambassador Hinterger, by the interpreter B, who interprets from English to German, whereas in the English original he is simply Mr. Hinterger. In the workshop sessions, English-speaking chairpersons frequently call speakers by their first names, whereas they are addressed as Herr, which means Mr., and Frau, which means Mrs., in the German interpretation. The problem is the fact that the appropriateness of applying this sort of strategy illustrated cannot be judged without a full documentation of the interaction. How much does the interpreter know about the speaker, the listeners, the person addressed by the speaker? Of course, knowledge about an interact is not the only relevant parameter to judge which degree of formality, familiarity, or explicitness best fits the expectancy norms in a given situation and culture. In the case study shown, the interpreters made their interpretation conform to target cultural conventions.
Another important aspect that is mentioned in the article are the jokes and funny stories that during the speech. For the simultaneous interpreters, these are the most feared challenge, as in these cases the interpreter cannot know if there will be a punchline or if the punchline will be funny in the target language. The only thing the interpreter can do is to follow the speaker till the end and hope for the best. Usually, transferring humor from one culture to another is not easy, and the listeners in the target language are left we're up with a feeling of whatever it was the word game, they didn't understand it well, while the people sit next to them that are listening the speech in the original language are laughing. This is clearly not the best functional speech they have. As an example, there is the figure 5 that the interpreter did not trust much in the word game that was going to be performed, so the technique he used was to make an explanation. But even if the funny comment cannot be translated, or even if it is short enough that can be left out, there is half of the audience that would not be laughing. This is why handling jokes in simultaneous interpreting does not depend on the strategy of the interpreter and his domain of culture, but on the random coincidence between certain elements of two languages and cultures. So, let's put ourselves in the situation where the interpreter is lucky and gets both the German and the English audience to laugh. The question here is, would it be a functional equivalence? Well, it is expected that it is not, but it is also mentioned on the article that the research on the contrast between English and German has not gone so far yet, so we don't have evidence about it. But it is also said, for example, that British and American speakers tend to be casual and their speeches have some parts of humor, while the German listeners have more stereotyped expectations. For them, if a foreign professional gives a talk and during the speech he gives the audience a personal anecdote, this could be considered as superficial, not a scientific speech, or that the speaker is overrated. On the other hand, a German speaker might be more dry, meticulous, even boring or intellectually pale. If these stereotypes were supported by empirical research, the practice of simultaneous interpreting would be a kind of adaptation to a cultural objective. However, most people who go to an international conference have some familiarity with other languages and cultures, and they are willing to go through this cultural crossover. Therefore, these participants may not expect the interpreter to take everything that is foreign, to take it out of the speech. But there is also people who have to go to these conferences because it is a duty for them. So these people, usually expect to have a suffer simultaneous interpreting without some intercultural effort. Whose culture is it anyway? Well, while the teaching of simultaneous interpreting can be offered in several languages, it cannot be denied that the number of languages most used is very small. For example, if a German translator wants to have a conversation with a Danish colleague, they both will communicate in English. The use of English in this type of conferences is a fact. For example, we have an international congress. This conference will only take two working languages. This brought together a total of 413 participants from 40 countries. One third of the participants came from countries in which English is an official language. 1/5 of them came from German-speaking countries, and the rest of the participants came from different countries that the official language can be several. So, the most of the participants would have followed and contributed with the proceedings in English. There is also the fact of the test used on the conference. More than the 22% of the tests were in English. Another fact is the speakers. For example, only 8 of them spoke German, while 9 of the German speakers preferred to use English. Thus, English was spoken 80% of the time. This is matching the 80% calculated in the studies. So the purpose of this is not to highlight the complexity of simultaneous interpreting in this conference, but is to demonstrate that it is necessary to refine the theoretical basis of interpretation studies in order to expand the available studies, the available empirical data that have been analyzed in the corpus. The conclusions of the article. Well, the entire article has shown that the abstract theory of translation and interpreting and how this theory has put into practice at international conferences. The first one is that by using theoretical concepts, there are more ways to benefit from the knowledge of both translation and interpretation. The second is that the concepts of modern theory are quite useful and allow a discussion of their application in conference interpretation. The third, the general theoretical concepts of translation and interpreting, however useful they may be, can be starting points for further evaluation through empirical research. The last one is that interpreter researchers can take up the challenge of studying not only the process but also the product of professional interpretation in a cultural situation. Thank you.